Welcome to the Cowboy Up Podcast, where talk is all about the West. This episode is brought to you by the Dude Ranchers Association and Golden Wings Horseshoes and produced by Cowboy Spirit USA. Have you ever been tempted to investigate the truth behind your family lore? Erika Bolstad decided to do just that. Her deep dive into her great-grandmother's mysterious life brought her not only to North Dakota, her grandmother's home, but across the country. She joins Russell and Allen to talk about her discoveries and her memoir, Windfall.
Good to see you, Alan. How are you?
Always happy to be here. I say this every week, and it's always true. This is one of the great places that I visit. Is right here.
I hope it never changes. We talk a lot about our parents and our grandparents. Your grandfather, I think, went from the east to Wichita.
He was, the East Coast didn't suit him, so he ended up in Wichita and thought he would stay there the rest of his life, but circumstances brought him to Duncan. Duncan was not a metropolitan area at that point in time, nor still is.
I was going to say, not now either, is it? Well, of course, my family, my dad was born in Wyoming, raised in Montana, but my mother was a Denver girl all her life, and they made their living in what they called at that time, they both worked. They were both what they called landmen, and they were oil lease brokers, and part of their travel, and I won't say it was always a good memories for them, were North and South Dakota, and they would go up and broker oil lease deals. So we have someone today who took a deep dive and a long drive in search of her grandmother's mineral rights up in North Dakota. And so she could have talked to my parents, and they would have probably had some common ground there. Erika Bolstad is a journalist, filmmaker in Portland, Oregon, author of Windfall. She spent a decade in Washington, D.C., covering politics, environmental issues for Climate Wire and the McClatchy Washington Bureau. In 2008, Pulitzer Prize finalist for work at the Idaho Statesman. She was also staff writer for Miami Herald, where she covered the Hurricane Katrina and other, of course, national stories. As a journalist, she's traveled from Alaska to Miami to tell stories about the effects of climate change. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, Scientific American, and many other publications. Thank you for joining us, Erika.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here, and I can't wait to hear some of these stories about landmen and some of these deals.
Well, you're going to hear them from you because we need to hear your side of that.
I know, but they sound great.
Well, I'll give the one that I there's a few, and if I think of it, but my mother had acute appendicitis in Fargo, North Dakota during a horrible blizzard. And she had to ride the snowplow to the hospital to have emergency surgery.
Wow.
And she considered that was going to be the last time she visited that part of North Dakota. She had some bad memories. So anyway, let's start with how your story starts.
Sure. Well, back in 2009, my mother inherited some mineral rights. And I think many of your listeners will probably know what those are. But it is when an oil and gas company offers you money, basically, a lease to drill beneath the earth. And a lot of people own maybe the surface rights but don't own the mineral rights, or vice versa. Or sometimes they own both. And in my case, my mother inherited just the mineral rights, so the right to drill beneath the surface of some land that her grandmother had homesteaded back in the early 1900s. And so when these mineral rights appeared in my mother's mailbox, when an oil company offered her money to lease them from her she saw it as this, this great windfall, which is the title of the book I wrote, and where that came from. But, at the time I was writing about environmental issues. I was in Washington, D.C. I was writing about environmental issues for a newspaper chain. And I, had a different reaction. I told my mother, this is fracking. This is that's what this is. And so, she died shortly after she inherited these mineral rights. And I took it upon myself to go find the story of, who they came from, the story of the great-grandmother who they came from, and spent the next decade going back and forth to North Dakota, really trying to unearth the story of not only my great-grandmother, but the story of the oil boom there and the consequences of that oil boom and my family's connection to all of it.
Well, that's a career right there. Tell us about where you come from in that picture. Are you happy to be a part of the oil rights, or is that something that should not be separated from the land, or where do oil rights fit in our life?
Yeah, sure. So when my mother first inherited those mineral rights, I was really curious about it, because at that point I lived in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Oregon and I live in Oregon now. But at that point I lived in Washington, D.C. and a lot of the things I wrote about connected to the big, kind of some of the big oil booms that were happening at that time. I felt kind of arm's length from them. I wrote about them sort of, from very kind of, unbiased journalist perspective, but I didn't really have a personal connection to any of it. And so when my mom got those mineral rights and I started poking around why we inherited them, I had a lot of questions, really a lot of questions. I mean, I didn't understand, how we don't own that land anymore. My grandfather sold off the land, which is, about 160 acres. It might have been a little more, a little less at that point, but, he sold it off in the 1970s when he retired, and he never lived in North Dakota after he left as a child. And so, we didn't have a kind of that physical connection to the land anymore. None of my family really lived in North Dakota anymore. And my, my mother, had spent some time there as a child, going back and visiting some relatives and seeing the place, but we didn't have a real connection to it. And so one of the things that I was doing when I was going back and doing all this research was, reestablishing my connection to that place, I think. And I, going there over and over again and finding out more about the story of my great grandmother's life, created this, I guess kind of helped me find some roots that I didn't know that I, had, and connected me to a place that I didn't really have a lot of connection to before I started going out there.
Did your grandmother ever live physically on the land?
So this is one of the stories that's at the heart of Windfall. We didn't really know that much about her. My mother never met her. And my grandfather, her son, he did not know her either. My great-grandmother was sent to the state asylum in 1906, 1907, and never left. She may have had postpartum depression. I'm not really sure entirely what was I don't want to even say wrong with her, because I suspect that that what was going on with her was something that in modern times might be able to be addressed. But she spent the rest of her life in that state asylum, and so my mother never knew her, my grandfather never knew her, and so she only lived there for a few short months right after she staked her claim there. And so her connection to the place is slight. It's very slight, but it was critical because she was the one who filed that claim and then got married to, my great-grandfather and had a child, my grandfather who was raised there and definitely felt deep connections to, North Dakota, although he left, as a teenager and, served in World War II and, never really came back there. But, and so, I didn't have that connection. And my great grandmother, she was gone for, she was there only briefly. But I will say that whenever I go there now, it feels like, I don't want to say home, but I feel deep in my bones, that this is a part of me in some way.
So how often have you been there? Have you gone there a lot of times? And is there a house there or what?
No.
Describe it just a little.
Yeah, I'll describe it. Yeah. So this is in northwestern North Dakota, and it's not a very well visited place. It's a quiet place. It's right near the Canadian border, just maybe 10 miles from the Canadian border, maybe less. And about, I would say 50 or 60 miles from the Montana border, which is just to the west. And so the county itself, where this homestead was, at one point there were 9,000 people living there when there was this big land boom in the early 1900s. And then things changed, and of course the Depression really blew a lot of people away. And so now there are maybe 1,200, 1,400 people living in this county. It's a very small place, very rural place. And, you'd have to have a really good reason for going there. Nowhere to stay, nowhere really to get a hot meal. I mean, it is a quiet place. And so the very first time I went out there, I actually couldn't find I didn't know if I was actually in the right place. It was, it's just a field now. It's a field in a place where there's a lot of, there's still some native grasslands nearby, some prairies, that are quite beautiful. It's quite an extraordinary place for bird life. Whenever I go there in early June, it is just exploding with migratory birds. It's pretty incredible. And, but otherwise it is a very quiet place. There's no evidence of any homestead there anymore. Any buildings that might have been there are long gone. And so, when I first went there, I wasn't really even sure. Am I in the right place?
Is it part of a bigger pasture? Is it being used at all? Is it just taking up space between Canada and the U.S.?
No, I think it's now owned by a farmer or a farm group of some sort. Sometimes when I've been out there, it has been planted with wheat. And sometimes it's just kind of barren. And so it is a little bit hilly and marshy there in parts. And so not all of it is cultivated, which is characteristic of that little part of North Dakota. There's a lot of just sections there that are not cultivated. And so you do have a sense when you were there, you can get this sort of sense of what in parts of it, what the prairie looked like. Yeah. And especially there's a big national wildlife refuge nearby that, where you can really get that sense because they have, it's not developed at all. There are no crops grown there. And they do have, some cattle grazing there occasionally to kind of mimic the effects of, the bison that would have been there 150 years ago, 200 years ago. But so, you can get a sense of it. Yeah.
Erika, so even though you grew up Oregon and been here and there, and you went back and you felt somewhat at home, I think I took away. How did, I'll back up for a second. I live in Arizona, and it's a transient, everybody comes to Arizona, you're a native if you've been here 7 months. And my family mostly lives in Wyoming, and I go there, and it's a very stable, people are there because they want to be. And I think there's something really special about that. And I suspect that's the same with North Dakota, because as you said, it went from 8,000 to 1,200, and people are there for a reason. How do you feel welcome?
That's a really good question. Yes and no. I was very conscious while writing this book and working on, a short film that goes with it, that I was always a visitor. And that, although I had some roots there, I didn't have any family connection anymore. And so I was very conscious of that. There are a lot of people left North Dakota in the 1930s. It really, there was a boom there in, the early 1900s, a land boom when some of the land, especially in the northwest part of the state, was opened up for settlement. And so there's a lot of people who came there, and then the conditions of working and living there were, very difficult. It's dry farming in a lot of those places up in northwestern North Dakota. And there's a lot of drought up there. It is kind of a feature of the place, not an anomaly. And so it was hard living up there. It's also very cold. And even though in the time that my great grandparents settled there, there was there was a railroad coming through and electricity and roads very, very quickly. It's still a remote place and remains a remote place. And it is hard to, it's really difficult to have any kind of economy that is not connected to either farming or, resource, extraction. And so the people who are there are tough. They're people who stayed because maybe they had, deep connections to the place, or because they survived, in the midst of a lot of very difficult, challenges, including what happened there during the Great Depression.
Is there anybody living on that piece of land right now?
She says just
no.
empty.
Yeah. There's no one. Yeah, there's a few farmhouses not far from there, but it's a pretty that little section of North Dakota is a quiet, not very populated place.
Well, on that, we're going to take a quick break and be right back.
Hey there, this is producer Lynn Wheezy Sneed. After 3 seasons of being hands-on with this podcast, I got to be a guest at a dude ranch. Along with my husband, we were celebrating our anniversary. How was it, you ask? Well, it was fantastic. We had so many activities to choose from. Horseback riding, of course, but also archery, which I loved, shooting, e-biking, a Jeep tour, arts and crafts, swimming. And then there were the delicious meals, can you say fall off the bone ribs, and happy hours and meeting people from across the U.S. and Europe. I have to say, Dude Ranch vacations are now a mainstay on our bucket list, and our resource for deciding where to go is the Dude Ranchers Association. They have the intel on 92 ranches around the West and are so helpful matching our needs and wishes to the right ranch. I encourage you to check out what Dude Ranches have to offer, whether for your family or a weekend getaway with that special someone, or even a solo retreat. You can reach out to the Dude Ranchers Association at duderanch.org or call 307-587-2339. Hey, I hope to see you on the trail.
So, Erika, I got kind of a sense that, it's exactly as I expected. It's North Dakota probably mimics Wyoming and parts of Montana, that, those areas that haven't been deluged from folks from other places. They have a continuity and a sense of place that most places just don't anymore. But how did you feel about I have the sense you're not maybe a big fan of the oil industry. And how did you feel about inheriting these rights?
I was deeply conflicted about inheriting these mineral rights. It's when I first landed in North Dakota, the first time I went out there to work on this project, I flew. And I flew to Minot, North Dakota, and that afternoon I drove up to where I was looking for my great grandmother's homestead. I drove up there, couldn't find it, and or wasn't sure if I'd found it. But that first day when I was there in North Dakota, I started seeing all the flares of from the oil and gas wells, and many of your listeners are probably well familiar with that site. If you live in Colorado or New Mexico or Wyoming, North Dakota, you have seen these flares out on the prairies and the plains, and you've seen the effect of oil and gas development. And so
everybody's going to know what that is. Explain a flare.
Yeah, sure. So a flare is when it's a byproduct of pulling up oil and gas. In North Dakota, in particular, there wasn't a lot of pipeline capacity, especially in the early days of that 2009 era oil boom, that Bakken boom. And so instead of piping the natural gas that they were pulling up out of the ground, they would burn it off right there at the source and just use the petroleum that was coming up and process that. And so you see all these flares, and you understand that, one, this is a pretty wasteful practice, right? That that natural gas is valuable in many places. It's sold
Right.
as a commodity, and could heat a lot of homes. That was sort of my first instinct. But then also it's for no reason at all other than that the petroleum has a higher value. It's just being burned off as waste. And that is like, I don't remember the numbers for what it was, the equivalent of, the number of cars on the road, but it is a really kind of like mind-bogglingly wasteful practice that's putting methane into the atmosphere and hastening climate change.
I was just reading this morning that you can see it from satellites. You can see the burn off
That's right.
from satellites.
That's exactly right.
That's a lot of burning. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no. I mean, it is sort of, you see these images that came out, and I think in 2012 that showed these big bright spots that looked like cities in the middle of North Dakota, whereas I've clearly said there is not much there. And so it just felt to me like, this is, I could see how suddenly these mineral rights that my family inherited, I could see how I had a personal connection to what was happening with climate change. And I didn't feel great about that. I didn't feel great about like taking these lease checks from the oil company. It meant that I was, very much involved in the practices and in profiting from what these oil and gas companies were doing out there. And so I was deeply conflicted about it. And I remain less conflicted about it. In part because my family, we never got rich off of these mineral rights. An oil company has never actually drilled on the land there. And all that my family has ever received from it is about, when I added up, maybe about $12,000 worth of leases over a decade or so. And so, that's not nothing, but it's also not a lot compared to if they had drilled there. And so, so I think that allowed me to have a little bit more perspective that I might have, I might have a different feeling about this if we're the gusher. I hope not. But I really seeing those flares that very first day really, I think sort of flipped a switch in me. It became not just something I wrote about as a journalist at arm's length, but something that I had a personal connection to. And that is really what inspired me to go back to North Dakota over and over again. I think I made 13 trips over 10 years. And I will, of course, be back. But I think that really inspired me to dig deeper and to really start to think more about why my family inherited these mineral rights and what the consequences of them might be.
Well, give us a little of the history. How many
Sure.
years ago did they get those mineral rights, and who did they get them from?
Yeah, so they came from, of course, the great-grandmother who homesteaded that land in the early 1900s. And so after she was sent to the asylum, her husband became the owner of that land. And when he died in 1945, my grandfather, he eventually inherited that the land from his mother and his father. And then he held on to it, through the 1970s. In 1951, there was a big oil boom in North Dakota. This was the first oil boom in North Dakota. And so my grandfather was living in Helena, Montana at the time, and my mother was a little girl. And they got lease checks back then in the 1950s. And those lease checks paid for my mother to go to college. And so there is a long history of this land and of those mineral rights, providing something of value for my family. And at the time, my grandfather leased it out to other farmers, but he also was paid not to cultivate it by a USDA program as well, because as I mentioned, there's a big flyway through there of migratory birds, and so that is one of the reasons why he was paid not to cultivate it for some years, and so. When my mother inherited those mineral rights in 2009, she didn't really even know that my family still had any sort of connection. She thought they'd gone away when he sold the land. But it turns out that my grandfather held on to the mineral rights because he believed that there was oil there. He really and truly believed it, because, it had first been leased in the 1950s, and there were other landowners around there who were getting rich off of the various oil booms that happened over, from in the 1950s, and then one in the late 70s, early 80s, and then this one in 2009. And so, so there's a history of that land having great value to my family. And so when they eventually came to my mother, and then my father owns them now, but eventually they'll belong to me and to my sister. When they came to us, it was a sort of circuitous path, but one that has a pretty direct line. You can see where it started with my great grandmother, and I really wanted to think a little bit more about who was there before my great grandparents settled there. As you know, in that part of the world, you spend a lot of time driving, and you have a lot of windshield time. And one of the great things about this project is I would go and do things and talk to people and report and spend some time in places. And then I would often have a lot of time to drive and consider what I'd learned and what I'd seen. And over the course of all those drives, I wanted to know more about who lived there before my great grandparents arrived. I was very curious about who was there before they arrived. And there wasn't much in those county history books or in the historical society's paperwork. And it took quite a bit of effort for me to find out. But over the course of time, I really started to think about whether maybe those mineral rights belonged to some of the indigenous people that lived there before my great grandparents settled there.
Are any of the indigenous people still living in the area, and can you trace them?
No, they are not. It was probably mostly inhabited by the Assiniboine people, and all of those folks are now the descendants of those original inhabitants. They are all now in Montana. And so I have been talking to some tribal elders with some Assiniboine tribal elders and talking to them about, whether it is appropriate that I don't know if donate is the right word or just kind of revert the mineral rights to the tribe itself. And I've begun to have those discussions about how to do it. It's not easy because it involves kind of an expensive title search, and as I've mentioned, I haven't really gotten rich off of this project, but the Windfall has been in uncovering the story, really. And so I'm starting to talk to them about what to do, and I think that maybe they might be the best decision makers about what should happen with the mineral rights and what the next legacy of them should be.
It's obviously an interesting perspective because, of course, some reservations, a lot of their income, particularly prior to gambling, really came from extraction. 13 trips to North Dakota, concern about climate, and yet you've had a lot of windshield time and met some folks, and I suppose, I imagine, come away with a very different perspective on North Dakota because you hadn't been there. Do you feel that altered your view on the personal side of the extraction business industry?
Yes and no. That is a complicated question. So I was back in earlier this year. I did a book tour in North Dakota. I did 2 book tours in North Dakota, and I went to Williston and had just a really wonderful time spending a day at a bookstore in Williston, North Dakota. If any of you were ever in Williston, North Dakota, go to Books on Broadway, which is just this fantastic bookstore there. And I spent the day, and people came through and really wanted to talk about their own experience with mineral rights. I met people who became millionaires because of the mineral rights that their family inherited from ancestors who homesteaded that land in the early 1900s or even before in some cases. And I met people who did not get rich off of it and who saw, what happened to their community because of the boom and bust economy that comes with, any big oil field discovery. And I met a lot of people who my father's family is from mostly from eastern Montana. And so I met a lot of people who came by who knew relatives of mine from that side of the family. This book is mostly about my mother's side of the family. But I even had people who came in and had drawn up a genealogy for me from that side of the family.
That's terrific.
Yeah, it was so heartwarming because I as much time as I had spent in North Dakota, I didn't really have a lot of those kind of connections, especially up in that northwestern part of the state. And so I really enjoyed that so much. It was honestly one of the best parts about writing this book. It was one of the best days that I have spent, talking about it. And I really, I think that having that personal connection, hearing those stories about, how it changed the community, and, it really, it was wonderful. And I get emails from readers who live in that part of the country and elsewhere who appreciate hearing that, that about the downsides of an oil boom like the one that swept through there, who appreciate hearing about the consequences and who really want to themselves, understand maybe some of the complicated legacies of land that they've inherited in the West as well.
What do you see looking forward? What's it going to look like 50 years from now? Do you have any thoughts or any ideas about what the land where it should go, what it should be like?
Yeah, so we've already seen quite a few changes in that part of the country from climate change. Not all of them are obvious, but one that is probably pretty obvious to farmers and ranchers there is that the growing season is about 2 weeks longer than it was in my great grandmother's time because of warmer temperatures, and so things are already changing or in the process of changing. It will be a different place in 50 years. And I hope, the book, I don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but I will say this, that I went to that place over and over again, over the course of a decade, and saw the changes that happened from the oil and gas boom, and then saw some alternative energy also be some wind turbines be installed within view of where my great grandmother had her homestead. And I thought that was just so interesting to see that. Interesting isn't really the best word for it, but it was a shift that I observed over the course of a decade. I saw these pump jacks go in. I saw all kinds of changes happen in some of the towns in that area because of the oil boom, real booms, real busts, and the effects of those. And then when I saw those wind turbines go up, I felt this sense of hope that perhaps, that is not the only kind of energy, the only, thing that will shift our dependence on fossil fuels in this country or elsewhere. But it seemed to me this kind of beacon of possibility. That's what I saw when I saw those wind turbines that hadn't been there when I first started going out there.
So just because we're running out of time, I want to just finish with circling back to, you said this book, of course, was mostly on your mother's side. Great-grandmother, did this journey of putting this story together, Windfall, did it affect you in looking back at your mother's family and your grandmother, et cetera? Did it bring you anything happen there for you personally?
Oh, so many things. Yeah, I really felt a deep connection and so much empathy for this great grandmother of mine, across the century. I really, I felt so much for her and the story of what happened to her. She was in this institution, against her will. And I feel as though some of those, there were consequences to that kind of echoed down into my own family's, connections and how they all sort of drifted apart. I think that's part of why they did, because this woman wasn't there. That was kind of the connective tissue of the family. And I feel like this book, this project is for her. It's for my mother, who would have absolutely loved to have, seen what I dug up in all of this. My mother was just a little bit gossipy, a little bit nosy, and this family history that I dug up, she just absolutely would have loved to have hear me tell it to her myself.
Well, that's the perfect way to end. Windfall, if you're not in which was the town in North Dakota at the Books on Broadway? If you're not there, you can get it anywhere, right?
Yeah, Williston, yes.
Williston,
yes,
Williston, North Dakota. So Windfall, simply Windfall by Erika Bolstad, and subtitled The Prairie Woman Who Lost Her Way and the Great-Granddaughter Who Found Her. This is everywhere. And any other information, Erika, that we should share with folks?
Well, I'm happy to, I share I have a newsletter that people can subscribe to if they're interested in hearing more from me. Yeah. And you can find that via my website, which is really easy to find, erikabolstad.com, or it's on Substack. And I love hearing from readers. So if anyone wants to reach out, I'm happy to chat with them about mineral rights, or, digging up your own family story, anything you can, any tips that I might have. I'm always happy to share them.
Well, super. And that's ErikaBolstad. We got that right, Erika? ErikaBolstad.com.
You got it.
All right. And they can sign up for the newsletter and get the book Windfall wherever they get their books. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Erika. Bye.
Bye-bye. Alan and I always want to thank Fred and everybody at Golden Wings Horseshoes for sponsoring our Cowboy Up podcast. These revolutionary horseshoes are like no other. And as they like to say, and I know, horses love them. They're made from a special non-metal compound. It took Fred 10 years to come up with it. I always ask him, what is it made of? Oh, I don't know. Okay, that's a kind way of, it's proprietary, and it should be. Took 10 years to get there. They're comfortable for horses because they absorb concussion and they are flexible. And, the big negative to putting metal horseshoes on horses, and you got to do it, despite what some people believe, some territory needs shoes. And, of course, metal doesn't flex. These do. They flex up and down and in and out. And when a horse's foot hits the ground, the ability to expand out is really healthy for the inner structures of the horse's hoof. I can absolutely, without hesitation, testify that these horseshoes, Golden Wings horseshoes, have helped a lot of our horses. Some are only on the trail because of them. And, of course, I told the story, I think, a month ago that Barb is winning buckles on her mounted shooting horse that had been retired until Golden Wings came along and put him back into competition. We have horses that were out of commission, and they're back on the all-day 18, 20-mile rides. So go to Golden Wings, plural, goldenwingshorseshoes.com, goldenwingshorseshoes.com. And they'll get the, and Fred, they're fast. They'll get the shoes right to you. And your horseshoe is going to be your new biggest fan because they're so easy to put on. Well, Alan, our family's in the oil business, not us. We're just the dude ranchers. But, our family's a few generations in the oil business. And, it's interesting, she talked about the wind turbines, and, there's a whole lot of studies that has a huge impact on birds. And it was interesting because she's in a flightway. And so nothing in life comes without a consequence. And the oil industry, I think, in America, in the United States, has done a pretty good job of cleaning up. But still, it leaves lasting impact wherever it goes and wherever it is. And, but so does everything else.
Sure leaves me wondering what's ahead, because you can see a finite end. There's a finite amount of oil, and then we go some other direction. So I end up wondering, where do we go from there?
You know what I think? I think we don't know where that is yet, because the existing clean technology can't do it. I mean, there's study after study. It just doesn't have that potential. So whatever's next is out of sight.
It'll be interesting to see.
Hey, we appreciate you being with us today. If you'd like to share any of your family lore or history, email us at thecowboyuppodcast@gmail.com. You'll also find us on Instagram and Facebook. Hats off to Stan Houston's production team. Next week, Bob Rosebrough saddles up to the ranch to talk about life, present and past, in Gallup, New Mexico. As he calls it, it's a place of thin veil. also the title of his award-winning book. Hope you can join us. Until then, I'm Lynn Weezy Sneed, reminding you to sit tall and ride safe.